Hey, John, how you doing?
Hi, Chris.
Hi there.
Yeah, why don't we get started, and then we'll join Hans in. I think one of our first questions here, Chris, was really around EV investment and interest has grown significantly this year. I mean, just whether there are commitments from OEMs, actual countries and states and municipalities have been committing to converting to EVs, or even banning the sale of internal combustion vehicles, and new EV companies being created overnight through SPAC and new public companies. So, what are you seeing in the market and the needs of OEMs? What are you seeing from them, and what is your organization, what is Exelon doing to support these new changing market opportunities?
So I think a couple of things. I think some of those market opportunities are being driven by different regulatory and government pressure points, right? You've seen we talked very briefly in the conversation. President Biden's put out an executive order and a target. You got states that are being more aggressive, and that's great, right? I think it's helping set the stage to enable the kind of change and innovation that you're seeing, whether that's OEMs moving their model mix very quickly, or it's, like you said, net new companies coming into play. From our point of view, what we're trying to do is take that movement, anticipate where it's going to show up in the markets that we serve, so that we can make sure that we've got the grid capability there, and then work very closely with those communities that we serve and those governments government bodies that regulate the utilities in those markets, and make sure that we're leaning in, right? Are we there with the right kind of rate approaches that encourage EV use? Are we there with the right kind of capabilities for enabling charging stations at home, right? We probably put 7,000 in last year, if I remember right. It's a big number that keeps just going up, but are we geared up enough, right? I think that's the piece that really has our attention, and I think that's what we can do to help, is just make sure that we're doing everything possible to lean in, meet those communities, government agencies, the OEMs and their thinking and their drive, where they're going, and make sure we got power in the right places so that people can use this new technology.
Great. Hans, we were talking about the new interest in EV and the growth of the market. We wanted to know what's your organization doing to support these changing market opportunities.
First of all, apologies. I couldn't get in. I don't know what happened. I was desperately trying to join you guys, and I had to basically start from scratch again. So finally made it. Yeah, that's the sort of thing that happens in virtual conferences, I guess. Anyway, so what we're doing is we are looking at some of the pain points in EV that drivers have, and that we feel we're specifically or in a specifically good position to help OEs with. One of the things is that EV-POI data out there, so the information about charging stations is currently very poor. The quality is very limited, locations are incorrect, the information is unreliable, it's not where it needs to be. What we're doing is we are improving that, leveraging the systems we have in place for parking and for creating reliable parking information. That's the first thing. The second one is that we combine it with parking information, because we feel that parking and charging are effectively two sides of the same coin. Just to illustrate that, give you an example. So an EV-POI database, and we've had these cases, I don't make them up. Gainesville college parking lot, charging stations, the providers of EV-POI data show them as free, available, etc. Well, the only challenge is you can only use them if you're staff, faculty, or a student and have a parking permit there. That sort of thing. So you need to have both ends of the information for somebody to actually be able to use it. Just focusing on the charger itself doesn't really help. You need both sides. And then eventually you need not only the parking payments, you also need the EV payments as one transaction for the driver. And all of that in the car. And that's effectively what we're currently doing.
Great. Yeah. So having that additional product and kind of being an expert in parking, I'm sure helps with that. What are other examples of technology collaboration? Can you describe that helps advance that adoption? I mean, obviously, kind of making sure that people know where they can charge helps. But what are areas that can be improved or focused on, kind of more in the immediate term as the market grows?
Well, there are some initiatives out there. Just to name one, plug and charge, or ISO 15118, which basically means that you enable vehicles to automatically charge and pay when they plug in. They're recognized. They have the relevant tokens that are in the vehicle, which allow a very seamless, very simple payment transaction, charging and payment transaction. But then you get those initiatives sabotaged by a last century government, in this case, the German government, lobbied by local banks, mandating the integration of credit card and debit card readers, physical readers, in charging stations in Germany, and which will have an impact on all of Europe. This is just to illustrate what we're currently dealing with. So there's a lot of effort that went into it, but then it gets sabotaged by last century thinking, and we're back to square one with all sorts of issues that are attached to it. In addition to that, as I said earlier, what we're doing is we're working with a number of CPOs and EMSPs to create integrated solutions that actually offer a seamless experience in the car, and not like what we have today, several apps that you have to use to actually be able to find charging and then pay for charging. So it's about, again, frictionless, seamless in-car experience.
Hans, is that something that you see as a bit different this time, that APIs are being built more readily and more quickly? What are you seeing from either MSPs or from energy companies? Are you seeing that approach being taken?
Well, what we see, well, there are two things. The EMSPs and CPOs we're dealing with, they're more tech savvy than the parking companies, for example. Things when it comes to technology and using technology to create user experiences, we are in a different world, so to say. It's much faster, much more elaborate, etc. But at the same time, we also see something else. In the past, a lot of the OEs were scrambling to get a solution in place ASAP, and what they did was, quote unquote, the easy way out, i.e. They took applications from EMSPs and CPOs and launched them as branded solutions. So OEM branded, but effectively it was a white label solution from an EMSP underneath. And that puts you in a position where then the EMSPs, some of them at least, think that they are in control of the EV charging experience at that particular OEM. However, none of those networks actually offer the full coverage and the full user experience across the board. So there is some friction in the market with established players that obviously want to retain customer relationships, and I cannot blame them. But at the same time, there's a certain level of reluctance to go all the way and to really create the in-car experience that would be necessary. And also the coverage that would be necessary to have a perfect EV user experience.
Yeah. So let me, Chris, let me focus a little bit on the U.S. infrastructure bill, and obviously as a company that's based in the U.S. and kind of supports kind of a large footprint and being a large energy company. How does something like that, you know, it's 7.5 billion earmarked for EV charging, 73 billion earmarked for grid improvements. How does that affect how Exelon focuses on EV going forward?
Look, our focus it's been front and center for a long time. We think that the infrastructure bill, the devil's in the detail, as it always is, right? When we see all that detail, we'll see how it shows up in the jurisdictions that we've got a key part in. But we think it's necessary, right? You're trying to make a massive change from something that's been embedded for a very long time. Hans's example that he just gave on payments, look, payments haven't been embedded nearly as long as the internal combustion engine has, and the infrastructure in and around it. So I think the bill will change some of the profile of adoption, hopefully speed it from our point of view. We think it's the right thing to do. It's good for our communities, good for their targets for being greener and healthier places for their citizens to live. So we're watching, carefully monitoring, engaging where asked, continuing to be very, very clear with our local communities and our state communities, which will be the administrative side of how that will show up, and making sure that we're plugged in and helping. So yeah, exciting times, right? I think it's a bold set of initiatives, and we want to help make those initiatives turn into reality.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Chris. I'm having a little technical difficulty on my side in hearing the response.
That's all right. Hans, did you hear my response?
I did, yes.
Yeah,
I did. Loud and clear.
I think it's just your end.
Yeah.
I think it is, you know, I finished it up with some comments. I think, look, there is not one answer. Hans pointed out really perfectly. There's some things that are coming out that we could all embrace, but we do have to move from where we were. And I think that's where I think this bold bill is intended to help accelerate change.
Well, and I have to say the U.S.
Great.
have an advantage here because unlike Europe, you can actually have a federal bill supporting state and local initiatives on top of that. We're far from getting something similar in Europe at this stage. The Chinese are potentially even more aggressive than the US right now, but in Europe, it's super fragmented, and it's the governments are all over the place right now. Yeah. Unfortunately.
I think you're right. There are places where it's going to go faster, and we'll all learn from that, right? That's good. At the same time, I think we've got to be sensitive to the fact that the legislative government environment that we all operate in is one we've got to navigate. We've had to navigate it for every other innovation that came along. I think EV falls right squarely into that same place. Yep. With a lot of embedded players that have a reason to protect market share. You know, their customer relationships are one thing, their market share is the other, and nobody's going to give that up easily unless they can find an alternative.
Sure. So is John back on?
Well, John's back on.
Yes, I'm back on. So I've been the bandwidth has been improving here. So Chris, I had a question. You know, 80% of the EV charging, as you mentioned to me before, Hans as well. The 80% of the EV charging happens at home. Has there been work by yourself or OEMs to provide a more unified view of the energy utilization and consumption? Can you speak to that?
Well, let me speak to how you move that from at home to everywhere else, right? I think we'll continue to see the dominant play for what we would have all went to the petrol or gas station to get fuel in the past. That it's going to be done at home. We don't think that model will change. People's cars, vehicles will be at their location until we all get into a autonomous shared model. But that's for a different topic on a different day. Today's model is very much going to continue to be dominant. Where that moves into longer range is where we've got to reach out and step up. And look, we this summer joined, right, one of the consortiums, the Electric Highway Coalition, to try and bridge that gap that as you move past the 100 miles from home barrier, to get away from range anxiety, we've got to come up with ways where there's predictable access. And it's a really good way to start. I don't think it's enough to cover everywhere, but it's great to see a group of utility companies and communities try and focus on the corridors between them, because that's going to be the intermediate point that people are going to need that extension and that confidence that they can get there. It's a start, and I think that'll continue to happen. But will we see a mass move from home being the dominant? We don't have that as a high prediction right now. We'll wait and see if that changes for some reason. We still think people are going to continue to have demand for at-home chargers, both kind of what I would call, medium draw and high draw in terms of rapid charge that they want. We're going to keep, that's where probably the lion's share of our projects are today. Hans, maybe talk a little bit about, you shared some insight with me before about city centers, and they're different, right? Then, because people don't have a driveway or a garage to put their car.
Yeah, so I mean, what we see is right now the biodemographic for EVs are the people that own a house and a driveway and a wall box to charge their cars. As EVs move into city centers where people just don't have that driveway and that wall box, we will need to find solutions for them to charge. Now, in major residential buildings, that may be easier, but for people parking in the street, that's going to be an issue. And we see that with the parking industry, for example, that they're having a hard time actually putting a lot of chargers into legacy parking garages, because the grid currently doesn't support that, and putting transformers in there is something that usually the fire departments don't appreciate that much. So there are a number of issues in terms of how we can actually roll it out so that people can have chargers in those locations. I mean, there are loads of ideas around balancing the load and all sorts of things, but in order for a parking garage to actually be able to have 50 or 100 cars charging in parallel, that is going to be an issue that obviously will have to be resolved as well. And then the other point that you made, Chris, which I think it's great that you guys are taking initiatives to equip corridors. That's great, because that's one of the key pain points that people have. They need fast charging for longer trips. Miles that people do with their EVs are in a radius of 30 miles around their houses. But when and you mentioned grandma earlier, so when they go and see grandma who lives 200 miles away, then they're getting into range problems potentially. Or even if grandma lives 400 miles away, then it absolutely becomes a range problem. And how do you solve that? And one of the issues we have today, for example, is that those DC chargers along corridors, a large part of those are not in the roaming networks. So in the US, for example, ChargePoint has good coverage, including other CPOs like EVgo and SemaConnect and Greenlots, etc., that offer Blink, that offer services also in a roaming scenario where they roam among each other. But Electrify America, with their DC fast charging network, are not part of it, and they stay away from it. And that's very unfortunate, because that's what actually that's what's needed to deal with the range anxiety and corridor problem, because that's where the fast chargers are. So yes, I think that's one of the problems that definitely needs to get addressed fairly quickly, so that people can actually switch to full EV and not just have EV as the local car to run errands, but as the single car to drive, go on a vacation or go and see grandma or whatever it may be. And that's going to be a huge shift.
Agreed.
So we lost.
What do you see as the kind of immediate what do you see as the immediate opportunities for the ecosystem to work together?
I'll throw a couple of ideas out there. I think.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, Hans just put some out there. I think this figuring out how charging station interconnects are going to get broader is one. I think getting closer on the charging standards, so that even as those charging stations are built up, they're built at the right spec, so that they cover the widest range. Because the OEMs are innovating, and that innovation, we all want it. But if we're going to get rid of range anxiety, we've got to have some interoperability and continue to strive to get more interoperability. And then finally, I think there's a commercial side of this that could use for some insight. What are the next set of vehicles that really could change the game in terms of not just city center use for buses and school buses and things that we've seen done, but what else, right? What are those other light duty, medium duty vehicles that would radically change how EVs were used, and take more greenhouse gases out of the equation? Hans, what else? You see it from a...
Yeah, well, one thing for us is general adoption of OCPI and OCPP. That would definitely help. It's still not the case. Lots of proprietary stuff out there. That will facilitate technical integrations, which will be important, or which are important already. And then obviously the point I tried to make earlier, interoperability and roaming will be necessary. We're dealing with a highly fragmented infrastructure situation in the US, also in Europe and elsewhere, but in particular in the US. So we need to make sure that it's easy for users to use a charge point, no matter where it is, as part of an overall service. And roaming can play a huge role in that, which leads to the next point, which is simplification of pricing, because right now, one of the key pain points is that pricing is completely intransparent, and creates all sorts of issues, so to say, for drivers, which also leads to scenarios which are potentially in the interest of local utilities, because, and I can completely understand that, the driver that stays within the 30-mile radius usually uses home charging, plus in many cases, the app of the local utility that also operates charge points. And as a utility customer, you get a better deal. And it's part of your electricity bill. At least in some cases it is. Not everywhere yet, but in some cases. And I would imagine that utilities are kind of headed that way. So if that's the case, then a large part of the charging will be separated from the integration part, and only long distance or vacation charging, let's say. So you drive down to the beach somewhere and you stay down mid-Atlantic somewhere, and then you have to charge in that area. So that's when you use your charging service in the car, which creates all sorts of commercial issues around it, because if you separate the two, then the occasional, I would even say rare use of the service will create a profitability or a business model problem, which will not facilitate adoption.
Yeah. No, Hans, it's a great point. And our customers are asking for that single bill. You're absolutely correct. We do it everywhere. Not now. We don't. But that's what they see the energy consumption, the rate cases that they are used to and know they want those to travel with them because they view their vehicle as now an extension of that. And I think that's an interesting education piece. We're going to have to figure out what's the right model. How do we pair that with the opportunities to have higher range with more diversity and charging capability? So it's a really good one. I think it's kind of, John, back to your word, we got to start putting some time and energy and effort in. Some of that is in that regulatory space that is probably one of the slower moving as opposed to the fast moving. So we're going to have to probably draw some of our regulatory bodies into that conversation too.
So Hans, have you seen OEMs? Look, it seems that OEMs are beginning to invest in the connectivity and charging applications in their EV development. Are you seeing this in terms of incorporate charging payment services for them? Are you starting to see OEMs begin to request and explore these options?
Oh,
Are
yeah,
you seeing
absolutely.
customers in this EV payment space?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now,
can you